me start this. One thing to keep in mind is that the United States in the 1890s went through a period where it was really getting aggressive, becoming aggressive around, overseas. Uh, the the wars against Native American nations came to an end around 1890, and the country going through a depression, an economic depression, um, and so in the 1890s, and so there was some concern as to how we're going to come out of this. There was a political organization got started um, in which it was basically one in which uh, it involved Southern white farmers, farmers from the Midwest, and blacks as well, called the populist movement. And the populist, again, there's this coalition began to make some noise. Um, they wanted a variety of things. They wanted to have people be able to vote directly for the representatives that is in the Senate, in the United States Senate, rather than have the state legislature choose your senators. They wanted to have secret ballots. In those days, ballots were not secret. Anyone could see who you're voting for. They wanted to nationalize the railroads or telegraph industries. Um, because of the Depression, they wanted to add silver. And there are a lot of new states coming in that had silver mines, and so money could be made. They wanted to add silver to the gold standard, that would basically deal with the value of the American dollar. Um, in those days, the value of the dollar is based on how much gold we had in our reserves. And so the populists were, so the populists became a political force during the 1890s. It did not last. In 1896, the Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska for the presidency, and the populists, after a lot of arguments and discussion, agreed to finally endorse Bryan rather than run their own person for president. And Bryan basically snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, or vice versa, snatched defeat rather from the jaws of victory. He had the election and basically ran a horrible campaign and lost to William McKinley. Um, and then the Populist Party pretty much came to an end, really, as far as its ideals were concerned, when gold was discovered in Alaska in 1898, and that ended the Depression once and for all. So the thing about the Populist Party, though, was that when McKinley won the election, and I mentioned before that there was a great deal of disagreement among populists as to whether they should endorse William Jennings Bryan or run their own candidate and endorse him. Whether he won or lost really was not an issue as far as some were concerned. It was brought up that, well, we really should run our own candidate because blacks will not vote for Bryan because he's a Democrat. They'll either vote for our candidate or they'll vote for Republican William McKinley. Well, again, they decided not to run their own candidate. They endorsed William Jennings Bryan, and the black population in large numbers voted for William McKinley. And so as a result of that, they were blamed for the loss, despite the fact that people understood why they were going to vote for McKinley. They still received the blame. Also, during the 1890s, you have a situation where the U.S. took over the country of Hawaii, which had an independent. I say country because it's an independent country with its own government. In the U.S., some American citizens overthrew that government in Hawaii. War was threatened against the United States by the country of Chile because the U.S. got involved in some internal affairs there, but nothing really happened. The United States threatened to go to war against England in 1895, The U.S. went to war against Spain in 1898 and then went to war against the Philippines in 1899, which lasted 3 years. Now, the Filipino-American War, one of the great unknown wars, if you will, came about because of the fact that as a result of the victory over Spain, the U.S. Negotiated with the Spanish that the United States would get control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and for $20 million, the Philippines. The problem, though, is that many people in Congress did not want the Philippines. It was understood it was going to be a colony, and they just felt it was against American principles to have a colony. After all, we were a colony ourselves and fought a revolution to get out of that situation. Also, there was some racism there in that both sides, those who supported grabbing the Philippines and those who opposed it, believed that they were inferior. But those who were in favor of grabbing the Philippines argued that it is our duty, the white man's burden type of thing, to uplift them. Whereas those who opposed, grabbing the Philippines understood that once you do that, it would allow Filipinos to actually come to the United States to live, and they did not want that. So that was basically the argument between what they call the imperialists and the anti-imperialists. But in order to make sure that Congress approved grabbing the Philippines, the United States started a war against the Philippines and then blamed the Filipinos. And our outfit out of Nebraska fired the first shots. The Philippine leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, tried to calm things down and said, let's talk. The U.S. refused to talk, and the war was on. And
is that why it's sometimes referred to as the Filipino insurrection, or is that just...
Yeah, exactly. They viewed it as an insurrection. Some people view it as insurrection. The U.S. actually promised Philippine independence if they supported the American venture war against Spain. And then when it came time, the U.S. then backed off on that claim, backed off on that promise rather, deciding instead to grab the Philippines as a colony. And to be quite honest about it, it was good that the U.S. did that because the fact that Germany and Japan also wanted the Philippines. And Japan especially was looking to expand. And the Philippines was in a situation where it had no experience of self-governance. It did not have a military at all and would have been helpless against Japan or Germany. Whereas when the United States took over the Philippines, almost immediately, they helped the Philippines set up its own government to basically learn how to govern. And then 40 years later, a little over 40 years later, 1946, the U.S. granted the Philippines its independence. There are still some strings attached in 46, but still the Philippines became politically independent. So, but in the late 1890s, 1899, when that war got started, the U.S. really did renege on a promise of independence. And the reason really was China. Everybody seemingly was trying to grab a piece of China for trade. Everybody's looking at the large Chinese population to buy things. So the British had already done so. And the Russians and the Germans and the Japanese are all looking at China and grabbing colonies in China. So the U.S. venture in the Philippines was about the fact that China was only 500 miles away. And the Philippines had great areas for fueling stations, coal stations, where your Navy can set in, get repairs, get fuel, food, what have you. So, they had great deep sea ports for the U.S. Navy. So that was really the big deal with the Philippines. And so, but this became really the first war where you have a significant, you had other wars where people were opposed to it, but you have a significant segment of the population now opposed the Filipino-American War was basically the Black population in the United States. They understood the ramifications of such a war. The complaint was that this is the war against persons of what we call persons of color. And indeed, the ramifications were great, and people understood that slavery could be an issue here, which in fact it was in some circles. Some Southern congressmen talked their constituents into supporting the war by saying there's a possibility we could make them slaves. And indeed, on the island of Sulu, which is north of Indonesia, but Philippine territory, there's a guy called the Sultan of Sulu, and he was approached by Americans, and he agreed to let them, have some of his people as slaves if need be. So you did have that. It never happened, but it was out there. So another problem here was that.
May I jump in real quick? I was just going to say this seems like it's sort of a classic play for the U.S., right? And sort of the number one go-to in the playbook where, sort of instigating a war, claiming for one reason, but really it's for something else. I immediately think of like the Middle East, right? And you could definitely argue that was fueled by racism as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and oil. So,
well, yes, that too.
and Vietnam actually was the same thing with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But what happened with the Philippines, though, yeah. So what you have here is that so the black population was opposed to this war, and several black soldiers. The most famous was a guy named David Fagan. Actually switched sides. He was an American soldier, and you had whites and blacks deserted. But you had several blacks who then went ahead and joined the Philippine side. Fagan was the most famous of them all. And it was believed by many that he died. There's a price on his head actually at one point, and that someone killed him, but it may well have been all fake. Fagan himself may well have lived into the Second World War. Some soldiers saw a black man who told them, asked if they were an American. And when they said, yeah, they were an American, the guy said, I haven't seen an American over 40 years. Maybe people think it might have been David Fagan. But the thing about it, though, is that during this period of time, the black soldiers and Philippine citizens, even though they were on opposite sides, actually had a very good relationship. They were not treated well by the white soldiers in the Philippines. And indeed, the racial epithet aimed at blacks was also aimed at Filipinos as well. They were not allowed into their own restaurants in certain areas. They were kicked out of their nicer homes. Well, they were kicked out so that the military brass could live in those homes. And so they were poorly treated in their own country. So with the relationship between black soldiers and Philippine citizens, well, this upset the American high command. So it got to a point where they decided to try to rush black soldiers out of the Philippines and back to the United States. But the war lasted 3 years, and when the war finally came to an end, black newspapers and magazines actually urged black citizens to move to the Philippines. And several thousand did up to about the year 1905, where things kind of, died down as far as that was concerned. But those who remained had to deal with a lot of stuff. Last time we talked about the Plessy versus Ferguson case. We talked about some of the laws that were passed and Supreme Court decisions that came about that pretty much diminished or hurt the ability of blacks to live in this country. And certainly that was the case here. So by the time we get into the early 20th century, the right to vote became an issue, for example. And it was always an issue anyway, but it certainly did not help with the populist movement and blaming blacks for William Jennings Bryan's defeat. Louisiana, among other states, but Louisiana was a state that instituted something called the poll tax. And the poll tax basically was set up so you had to pay like $1 every year. You had to re-register to vote every year. And it cost $1, which for people was a lot of money in those days. Maybe it's like $100 a day for all I know. I don't know what it's worth in those, in today's terms. It was a lot of money, and people could not afford it. The problem is that not only could blacks not be able to vote and register, but poor whites could not either. And so for 2 or 3 years, you had a situation where very few people were able to vote until finally the Louisiana legislature passed something that became known as the Grandfather Clause, and other states began to follow. The Grandfather Clause was basically one in which if your grandfather was a citizen before the year 1868, you did not have to pay the poll tax. Right? 1868, of course, was the year of the 14th Amendment. when it gave citizenship to blacks and to European immigrants. So if that's the case, then they're automatically out as far as the poll tax is concerned. But it's allowed poor whites to vote and still hurt blacks and their ability to vote.
So that's kind of like a repeat of the 17th century of creating division between the poorest class using race, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so now the grandfather clause actually was ruled unconstitutional in a Supreme Court case in 1915. But still, though, the idea was the same, and there are other subterfuges used to prevent blacks from voting. We'll get into that in the future, actually, in a future lecture here. Because
I was going to say, you could probably spend several episodes talking about current voter suppression, let alone, the history of it.
You're right about that. You're definitely right about that. And but some of these court cases are crazy, and so we certainly will get into that. This is also a period of time in which the military, you'll find that there's a great deal of racism in the military and riots taking place where black soldiers were attacked. You'll find that this is also a time when literature and music and were quite racist, actually. And it was, some of the music that came out that was anti-black was unbelievable. It really was unbelievable.
Wasn't this around the time period of Birth of a Nation?
Yeah, the book came out around 1905 or so, written by Thomas Dixon, A Birth of a Nation, a romantic history of the Ku Klux Klan. And then it became a movie around 1915 by D.W. Griffith. And so it was a very difficult period of time. And of course, lynching was commonplace as well. And indeed, that became a big political issue later on, 3 decades down the road here when Roosevelt was president, trying to get an anti-lynching bill through. But in the meantime, though, it was a very difficult time to be black. When Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title, against Tommy Burns in Australia around 1908, you had this thing where they had to find someone, a white boxer, to defeat Jack Johnson. Even then, the heavyweight champ of the world was probably the most prestigious award, or title anyone could have. And so Jim Jeffries, who was the undefeated heavyweight champ, big guy, like 6'6", like 250, and then retired, was called out of retirement, and he came and fought Jack Johnson. He was known as the Great White Hope, and indeed a musical called The Great White Hope came out around the late 1960s. But so by the time, he agreed to fight Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries weighed over 300 pounds. So he was in bad shape. But he worked diligently. The guy was a very good fighter. He worked diligently, got his weight down to about 260, and they had the fight in Reno, Nevada. And Johnson defeated Jeffries, and that caused riots all across the country here. There were plans to show, they filmed the fight with the idea to be shown in movie theaters of Jeffries defeating Johnson. But obviously when Johnson won the fight, that fight was never shown. You can Google it, find it on YouTube. Excuse me, not Google, but YouTube. You can find that fight on YouTube.
Like 20 pixel video quality?
Yeah, it's not bad. It's pretty good. I believe it was pretty good quality. And I've seen it. So I've seen the fight, actually. So anyway, so you had that situation here. And also during this period of time, Congress also embarked on a quest to try to prevent blacks from joining the military. And blacks could not really rise very high in the military in those days. They could be stewards and they could be cooks, and that's pretty much about it. But the plan was to replace those Filipinos. And so Congress tried to vote on preventing blacks from joining the military around 1906. That failed. And then around 1913, there was another try, and that failed. And then finally, there was one last try, but World War I broke out. and so it never really got off the ground because black troops are going to Europe to fight. The problem that they had, though, as far as the black troops are concerned, their problem was that the U.S. military didn't want them, and so they fought. So the French basically said, "Look, if you don't want them, we'll take them." So black troops fought under the French flag. About 90% of black troops fought under the French flag, and actually fought very well. Maybe in the future we'll get more into that, maybe next time out. But the thing about it, though, is that up to this period of time, though, it was something in which they were not welcome in the military. You did have civil rights leaders popping up here. W.E.B. Du Bois was one. Monroe Trotter out of Boston was another. And A. Philip Randolph was a third. But Randolph was a socialist, and socialism seemed to be coming along very well at this time if you were a socialist, but it never really made much headway after that. But again, though, when you talk about some of the big issues here, and I'm skipping a lot, I'm sort of skipping around a little bit here, and I apologize for that. But, but there's so much going on there. So that leading into the war, into the war era, you did have two leaders, though, that were at odds. And I really should bring this up here. You had Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, in the early part of the 20th century, wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, in which he discussed the difficulty of being black in this country in many respects. Booker T. Washington was the acknowledged black leader. He was, people believe, an accommodationist. Whereas Du Bois was into the idea that blacks should become well-educated, become professionals, teachers, lawyers, doctors, what have you. Washington felt that blacks should work with their hands, work on farms. But understand here that Washington was in the South. He's the one who started Tuskegee Institute down in Tuskegee, Alabama. So he could not sit there and advocate for voting rights like Du Bois could, or social equality like Du Bois could. Washington, and indeed actually said quite the opposite. He would not advocate for that. And because of that, he actually became the darling of wealthy whites, and who contributed a great deal of money to Tuskegee. Washington rarely used the money for personal gain, but he did funnel a lot of that money back north to fund lawsuits for voting rights. So he was doing a lot of things undercover, if you will. One of the things that Washington advocated in the late 1890s and early 20th century was the idea that white business owners should hire blacks. Hire them. We're loyal. And we will work for you and work very hard for you. And he really pushed that. And give him credit. He was also one of the first people to advise black farmers about crop rotation. Don't grow the same plant in the same place all the time. Rotate them. It'll help your soil. Washington advocated the idea that blacks should support black businesses, black-owned businesses. So in his own way, he was quite nationalistic in his own way, from that perspective.
Isn't that kind of crazy that same message is still being pushed today, though? 100 years later.
Yeah, I don't think it's crazy, but I know exactly what you're saying. I know exactly where you're going with that. Mm-hmm. And that it began with Booker T. Washington was viewed as an accommodationist rather than the nationalist. So he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth in many respects, largely because he had to. But I will say this as well, and that is that Washington later became quite bitter because those businesses were not hiring blacks. So toward the end of his life, he really began to speak out against racism, white nationalism, and speak out against those business owners who would not hire blacks. So when he died, it was one of those weird situations where Du Bois, in his own way, became somewhat of an accommodationist, where Washington became more of a nationalist. Whereas, 10 years before that, the roles were reversed. So during this period of time, from 1900 up to about 1915, you have really serious problems with regard to racism, with regard to the way the media portrayed blacks, the lynchings, the growth of the Ku Klux Klan, attempts to try to prevent blacks from joining the military. And but then World War I came about, and that really sort of changed everything around.
May I ask a question jumping in here?
Right ahead.
So I could not imagine fighting for a war for a country that actively, as you mentioned, sort of doesn't want you.
Mhm.
I was sort of wondering if there was sort of a pushback, against, these people saying, hey, we're not going to war. It's very clear that you don't want us there. Why would we go in the first place?
I'm going to really discuss that the next time out, but let me just say this: the people who were the leadership were divided three ways. Yet Monroe Trotter said this is a racist nation, and I do not advocate blacks going to war for a nation that is racist. Now, if this nation were to come out with the president, Woodrow Wilson, who himself was racist, came out and said, we will stop our racist policies, then okay, go fight. Okay. A. Philip Randolph said, well, this is a war for capitalism. And actually, he's pretty much on target in many respects. This is a war to protect capitalism. And since they're not going to allow you to be capitalist, you should not fight. And then Du Bois said, we should go fight. Show them we're willing to fight and die for this country. And then once we come back, then we will, then they will hopefully see that we deserve to be treated equally. If not, then we'll have to fight for our own rights.
Yeah, always the optimist, seems like.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we see a lot of those themes continue. Minus a couple, but like Robbie's saying, the push to support black businesses and try and get the proper portrayal and representation in media. And if we're trying to, connect the past to present, that's one of the things that keeps coming up is those same themes that we're trying to fight for or that have been fought for.
Yep, exactly. So yes, that's basically what went on at that period of time there. Again, it was a very difficult time. If you were a black soldier, it was tough because people in the South just could not stand to see a black person in the uniform. And so he was taking his life in his own hands when he wore his uniform. That was as true as recently as after World War II. Mm-hmm.
I remember actually our cousin Julian sent me a text about that actually. What was it? Something about a black soldier who got lynched because he refused to take off his uniform.
Yeah.
What was the name? I don't remember, but it was a World War I vet who came back from battle, didn't take off his uniform, got lynched for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's wild.
Yeah. So it was a difficult time, very, very difficult time. And I think that in the end, what you have here is that, again, when we come back, I'll talk about World War I. And, but there is something like Colonel Charles Young, for example, who who was a colonel, a black colonel in the Army. And he was in line to be promoted to general. And rather than promote him to a position that high rank, they basically retired him, saying that he had high blood pressure, could not go on. And Young said, I don't have high blood pressure. And he was from Wilmington, Ohio, and he rode a horse from Wilmington to Washington, D.C. to prove that he was in good shape. And but it didn't cut any ice with the Army. So you really had to deal with all kinds of stuff. But the next time I will talk about Young and other people and the World War I, because that's more something I want to get into because it's a lengthier conversation.
Yeah, I know that we talk a lot about politics and war go hand in hand. We've talked a lot about military movements and everything like that with regards to race. Socially, though, during this time period, what was the landscape? Any major events or major movements by groups or organizations during the early 20th century that you want to talk about?
Organization or events early in the 20th century?
Yeah, or whether just, I guess, the general social landscape or existence of the a black person in the early 20th century, independent of the military. So I know that this is like one of those, dead spots I kind of keep talking about in history, that we don't really know too much about outside of the context of war. And I know that, prior to 1930 or 1940, really, we don't really have much about like what was going on with, I guess, treatment of black people or any major, events. I mean, I know the one people kept talking about back in July was, Black Wall Street. But were there any events that took place in the early 20th century that really haven't been talked about or covered? Or
I think that there are so many little things that may not have been little to the individuals involved, but they all sort of ran together. I think probably the major event really was Jack Johnson's situation. There in Texas in 1903, 117 years ago, there was a case where something was going on in Texas, a big party or celebration, and several people were shot, and there were some black troops stationed nearby, and they were blamed for it. And so there's literally going to be a march on the military base to get these troops. But there was a weapons inspection, a bullet inspection, because all the weapons and bullets were counted and stowed away. And so when they counted the weapons and the bullets, none of them were used. And apparently the troops were all sleeping when this happened, but it didn't really make a difference because people came after them, including white soldiers. And so you had this big, this attempt at lynchings come about. Eventually the soldiers they finally stopped all this, arrested the soldiers, put them on trial, court-martial. They were found guilty of instigating whatever was going on here. And many of them were, a couple were Medal of Honor winners. And so they were put away in prison. Some were released early, some were not. And I think Richard Nixon in 1970 actually granted them pardons, long after they died. So you did have that. During the Spanish-American War, you had black soldiers guarding Spanish soldiers in the United States. They captured some soldiers, brought them to Florida. They're going to take them to a prisoner of war camp. They're guarded by black soldiers. And the Floridians and Georgians were very upset by that. They went ahead and literally spat at the black soldiers while giving flowers to the Spanish soldiers, the enemy. So that was obviously a problem here. But organizations would have the bigger problems in those times. Organizations dealt with unions, and that was a big thing there. But not anything that dealt with black soldiers or black people in general, as far as organizations were concerned. The next thing you'll get to really, NAACP was founded in 1908, in 1909 rather, by a white woman. She's the one who got it started.
Wow, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, She had the first meeting. W.B. Du Bois attended the first meeting of NAACP. He was one of the original members of it. So the woman named Mary Ovington started the NAACP, and she did so as a reaction to the 1908 race riot where blacks were attacked in Springfield, Illinois, and that was significant because that's where Lincoln's
from. Yeah,
exactly. So she's the one who really got the NAACP rolling.
And NAACP, like I mentioned before, is more about the legal side as far as civil rights and everything like that.
The NAACP originally was an organization that tried to help black people find jobs, and then it sort of morphed into getting involved into legal situations here.
What was their first big case that they were, I guess, associated with or part of?
Good question. The ones that I'm familiar with took place in the 1930s. I actually want to get to that later on. This is some of those court cases I was talking about.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, so in 1930s. There was a case that dealt with something called the Scottsboro Boys in Alabama in 1930, 1931, where some black kids, about 9 of them or so, were falsely accused of raping a couple of white women on a train. And so they were found guilty. And when they had a retrial, the NAACP wouldn't touch it because of the fact that the Communist Party wanted to get involved in helping defend these kids. There was one of the greatest lawyers in American history, a guy named Clarence Darrow, who was white, did a lot of work for the NAACP. But the NAACP would not let him take this case, the Scottsboro Boys. So the NAACP always concerned about his image. And, but still though, so they got a lot of criticism for this because they said, you're more concerned about your image than protecting these kids, you know. But they eventually get involved in all this. But
why did the Communist Party want to get involved on this case?
Because they're trying to recruit. They're trying to recruit.
Gotcha.
You know, and they didn't care who they were recruiting. You know, if you can get blacks, that's fine. Mm-hmm. And you know, so that was their view.
Gotcha. I actually have a question from something you said earlier, and maybe this is more for the mailbag or something later. Slight tangent, but you'd mentioned William Bryant and sort of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, right? Purely running on a bad campaign. Mm-hmm. And that sort of reminds me of our most recent election, last election with Hillary versus Trump, where, again, I'm not an expert, but it seemed like it was sort of Hillary's to lose, right? And she ended up losing. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you had other examples of this in history. There's like some couple famous ones potentially.
Yeah, Hillary's case, I think, is, you know, Trump did have help, obviously, and there's a lot of dislike toward her, which, you know, which is quite fascinating. But the most famous election, we talk about that, was 1948, Harry Truman versus Thomas Dewey. And in fact, you had 3 Democrats running for president. You had Truman, you had Henry Wallace, who was Roosevelt's vice president from 37 to 41. And you had Strom Thurmond, who ran on the Southern Democratic ticket called the Dixiecrats. You know, segregation now, segregation forever. So those were 3 Democrats.
I'm guessing he was a Southern guy.
Yeah, out of South Carolina.
I figured.
And the 3 Democrats run against Republican Thomas Dewey. It was easily Dewey's election to win, and the truth of the matter is, Dewey flat out gave it away. He ran a horrible campaign. And a lot of that to do with his personality. Truman was out there hustling like crazy, giving speeches at 6 o'clock in the morning on the back of a train. And he's just everywhere, campaigning like crazy. And Dewey was just a very relaxed guy who, I'll campaign, and he did campaign, but for example, Truman spoke at Terre Haute, Indiana at 6 o'clock in the morning. Dewey, a few weeks later, was there. Train spent the night at Terre Haute, Indiana. Well, he didn't speak till 10 a.m. The people were there at 6. Dewey didn't wake up till 9:45 or 9:30 because nothing was going to get him up before he was ready to get up. And so by the time he got to be around 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, people were throwing rotten vegetables at Dewey's train. And, you know, but he ran really, as a matter of fact, he thought he had it locked up so much that in the last week of the campaign, he considered not campaigning anymore. And, you know.
Wow.
You know, what a guy.
You know,
yeah.
And, but everybody was so convinced he was going to win, including him, that, you know, why bother? You know,
right.
He did, but he thought about not campaigning. So, you know, he was very, very upset. Now, to tell you a story about your grandmother and your great-grandfather, son, your great-grandfather was a hardcore Republican. And your great-grandmother was a Democrat. So anyway, your grandmother went to visit her dad in 1948 and went to see him. And he told her that Truman was in town and he went to see his motorcade. He was up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she looked at him and said, "You're voting for Truman?" And this is like, I believe, probably August or September 1948. And he said, "Yes, he is voting for Truman." And then my mother told me, your grandmother told me at that point, she knew Truman was going to win because if her father was going to vote for a Democrat, then everybody else is too. And so she knew it was in the bag for Truman at that point in time.
Wasn't that near that paradigm shift where I guess black people were starting to shift to the Democratic Party after people? Not yet.
They were voting Democrat because of the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
And they did vote for Truman because he integrated the military. But they went right back to Eisenhower in 52 and 56, and they were going to go for Nixon in 1960. And then Martin Luther King got arrested, and the Kennedys got him out of prison.
Wow.
And that's where the shift took place.
Huh. That's interesting. Well,
You know what he's arrested for? You know why he's sent to prison? He was sent to, I'm talking about prison, not jail, prison in Georgia. He was sent to prison because he was driving an expired driver's license.
Damn.
Yeah, they were going to find any reason.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, Al Capone on taxes and MLK on expired driver's license.
I was going to say, yeah, for very different reasons, obviously, but
yeah.
Al Capone similar.
Well, I'm kind of curious about, wait, what?
Let me run here. I have a student waiting for me.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And unless you want to continue this in a few minutes, let me take care of her first.
No, I mean, I guess we can reconvene on a different date too. I mean, we covered most of what you wanted to cover. We can always talk about some other stuff later.
Okay, we can do that.